Diana, I know that you've written about eugenics multiple times and have made the argument, which I think we'll probably go through today, that actually most people are much more sympathetic to eugenic policies than they might realize, in the sense that there are already lots of policies in existence that could be described as eugenic. We just tend not to use that word because it has terrible connotations. And I think you would be in favor of actually going further with some of these policies. So maybe you could start by laying out your policy program, or the sort of principles that you might like to see enacted, and then we can go from there in terms of Lyman's responses.
Eugenics gets misconstrued a lot. I think when people talk about eugenics, they think about extremely violent and coercive practices, but there have been very many different kinds of eugenics policies. So eugenics is a literal translation of the Greek for good birth, and it aims to improve the population through interventions. Positive eugenics aims to increase good or desirable traits, and I'm going to put scare quotes around good and desirable, whereas negative eugenics aims to reduce bad or undesirable traits. So the scare quotes are meant to indicate that there have been divergent views about what is good and bad. This is an argument that some people have made. Jews are very productive members of society, and yet some people did not want them in their society at greater than average rates, or at any rates at all. And so I would consider that actually an anti-eugenic policy to kill all the Jews. But that was actually a eugenic policy at the time. So positive eugenics is not going to be talking about very much. We're going to be talking mostly about negative eugenics. And in my piece that I wrote a while back called You're Probably a Eugenicist, I talk about a couple of negative eugenics policies. So negative eugenics policies are meant to discourage people from having children whose children are likely to have genetic or other problems. And I talk about this case in Germany where a brother and sister, Patrick and Susan, met when she was 16. I think he was in his early 20s when they met, and they started having a relationship, and they had 4 children. And because they were full siblings, 3 out of 4 of their children had extremely severe physical problems. I mean, their mother, Susan, was also cognitively disabled, so there was all kinds of problems going on. But one of them required a heart transplant. I think one had epilepsy. And I said, most people are against incest. And what the German state did was they imprisoned Patrick for some period of time, but they never just offered, for example, to sterilize Patrick. They could have said, Patrick, you're not doing very well. We'll give you, I don't know, some amount of money to sterilize you. But they didn't do that because that would seem too much like eugenics. But imprisoning him for years was not considered eugenics, even though the same kind of principle applied. So, as I said, eugenics policy has sometimes been brutal, violent, and coercive, stuff like murder and forced sterilization. But there's also a lot of eugenics policy that we agree with. The other example that I use is in the case of first cousin marriage. First cousins, when they get together, they tend to have a double the rate of birth defects. Now, this is more compelling in cases like in Pakistan and Afghanistan, where people are double first cousins who are as related as half siblings, or people who engage in like iterated first cousin marriage, where they become more related to their spouse and their kids over time. And this causes problems because if you have deleterious mutations, those are likely to accumulate if both of you have them. In the United States, first cousin marriage is illegal in a lot of places. And in some places, like in Arizona, the writing of the law is quite transparently eugenic. So in Arizona, you're only allowed to marry your first cousin if you're both infertile and you're over the age of or you're over the age of 65. That's the kind of thing that people would agree with. So what kinds of policies I would put forward, what kinds of negative eugenics policies I would put forward are things like carrier screening for people with Huntington's disease that's free or subsidized or in some way incentivized. That is, the government would pay for this, or even people who have Huntington's disease, which is a terrible disease that is ultimately fatal, that you have a 50% chance of passing on. We can get into the reasons behind this more. Other policies that I would favor are, for example, if somebody is in active addiction for drugs or alcohol, there's a nonprofit called Project Prevention that pays women and men money and subsidizes them to either be sterilized or go on long-term birth control. This is a nonprofit that runs currently in the United States. They were sort of run out of the UK after just sterilizing one heroin addict, and I can go into that more. This is a kind of policy that I would be in favor of the government doing, because a lot of these children end up in foster care, and the reason that we don't offer these people contraception is because it smacks of eugenics. Even if you're problem with addicts having children ultimately has to do with the environment that they would make for their offspring. And I would also say that we should offer contraception or sterilization, maybe incentives for people who are imprisoned for certain crimes, or people who are institutionalized for things like schizophrenia or a psychotic episode. Certainly, somebody who's institutionalized for schizophrenia or a psychotic episode, when they get out, they're probably not in a good place in life to have a child. And so that would be kind of appealing to their self-interest. Essentially, it's just an accident of nature that we have children so easily when we have sex. And a lot of people don't really want to conceive a child when they engage in sex that ultimately will lead to that. So what I'm saying is that, we shouldn't put people in prison if they refuse to get sterilized. What I'm saying is that we should implement various different nudges that prevent people who are going to provide both poor lives for their children and also pass on genetic problems to their children to not reproduce or to take contraception.
So it's not what we're debating today, but just to spell it out, positive eugenics is when you encourage some people to have more children.
Yeah. So, for example, Lee Kuan Yew was very disappointed that Singaporean men were marrying women who were not college educated. And so he arranged singles cruises for college educated people to get together. And there have been jokes around positive eugenics, like there are programs for gifted youth to go someplace in the summer where there's very little to do. This could be, construed as a positive eugenics program. Yeah.
We could probably have a whole other debate on that, because this obviously feeds into pronatalist policy, which Lyman and I are particularly interested in, have spoken about previously. Lyman, maybe I should come to you on this claim that Diana makes, that actually we already have various policies in place which are completely uncontroversial, like, for instance, forbidding siblings from having children together, that could arguably be described as eugenic. And sometimes the reasoning is explicitly to do with that genetic defects. What do you make of her characterization of that, of the status quo?
Yeah, right now a lot of incest laws are written in a eugenic way. This is a little bit silly because incest laws didn't begin with the discovery of Mendelian genomics. Okay, incest laws famously go back at least to 700 to 1000 AD with the Roman Catholic Church assuming basically supervision of European marriage. But actually, cultures have had incest taboos throughout history, and this was not because they were aware of genetic deformities. Okay, in some cases, maybe some of them were, but the reality is most historic cultures didn't even understand selective breeding until like the 1800s. Incest bans, in fact, or rather social norms against incest, have a totally different origin. They originate essentially in religious rules that are rooted in disgust for incestuous behavior, in a recognition that incestuous behavior both degrades the natural family, that most religions, because religions are basically a long-run kind of like group fitness strategy, they degrade the natural family. That is, they take efficient reproductive units and they make them very inefficient, because instead of a bonded pair investing consistently in children, you start to get weird dynamics that divert resources in really inefficient ways, even aside from birth defects. This is also, by the way, why monogamy has outcompeted polygamy everywhere, always, in all times. Even today in sub-Saharan Africa, monogamists have more kids per woman than polygamists do. But furthermore, incest creates really inefficient social tribalism. Okay, so like highly incestuous societies tend to be not only genetically inbred, which is something that historic people basically couldn't really observe in a meaningful sense. There's actually maybe a few societies where they might have been able to, because inbreeding was so intense, like Bronze Age Crete, possibly might have had rates of inbreeding high enough that it was like they might have been able to observe what was going on. But rather, anybody can recognize that when you've got a group of families that are all marrying cousins to each other, that they tend to prefer each other more, not just as romantic partners, but politically, for resource exchange, for all these other things. So societies develop anti-incest rules for reasons of basically like just disgust, for the same types of reasons that most societies converged on monogamy as the dominant form of mating, not the only form. Elite polygamy is a thing like almost everywhere. It's a thing even in technically completely monogamous societies, but as the dominant norm, monogamy is almost always the dominant form, and because it's just socially inefficient on other levels. I would also say that on like the question of, something like Huntington's disease.
Before we get on to that, can I turn to Diana just for this question about incest, so that we can not get too confused? Diana, your response to the origins of incest.
Oh, sorry.
taboos.
I should also mention, in the German case, they were offered sterilization, right? Germany's a public payer system. People can just go get sterilized, and they were offered it. They declined. They wanted to have children. So I think it's worth mentioning that, like, now they may have eventually gotten it, like, after. I think
he was sterilized.
Go to prison.
He got a vasectomy.
Yeah. Eventually they do. I think they were finally like, well, we've gone to prison too many times. But like, this was actually always on the table for them. Germany's not like a hard place to get sterilized.
They didn't offer to pay them.
It's a public payer system. They can just go anytime.
Yeah, but I'm saying that they didn't give them any incentive, right?
Diana, this question about the origins of incest taboos. I mean, I'm guessing you're going to say that this disgust thing probably does actually come from some kind of evolved recognition that this is causes disease.
So I'll do a brief review of this. So the idea is that incest, or disgusted incest, is intuitive eugenics. You don't have to have an understanding of genetics. And there's this thing called the Westermarck effect, where if you are raised with somebody over time, you are likely to experience disgust at the idea of having sex with them, regardless of whether they're related to you or not. So our evolved psychology uses heuristics of relatedness. There's a woman called Deb Lieberman who's done studies on this. She did one very amusing study where she asked young men to imagine French kissing their sister, and she trained a camera on their faces to record their responses. Men who did not have a sister sometimes smiled at the idea of French kissing their sister, whereas men who did have a full sibling found it disgusting. So this is the idea that these disgusted incest comes online when we have full siblings, and it's as an avoidance response. You don't need to be able to understand genetics. And there are places like in Taiwan where they had child marriage. And, when you introduce a boy and a girl at a very young age and say you're married when they're 6, 7 years old, they actually have very low fertility because people don't want to have sex with one another if they know each other from a very young age. And so there's a big literature on this. And it's one of those weird forms of disgust where we're not just disgusted at having sex with our own brothers and sisters. We are also disgusted when other people have sex with their brothers and sisters. So you might be right, but it seems to me like the rate of birth defects and the rate of, stillbirths, miscarriages, things like that are going to be a greater selection pressure on both the culture and the disgust than, for example, greater tribalism or fewer resources for offspring.
One of the very cool things in the last decade and a half is that we've learned a lot more about ancient family structure from basically archaeogenetics, right? So you can pull a skeleton out of the ground, and if it's suitably preserved, you can know how closely related the parents were, right? Through runs of homozygosity and different lengths of them. And as a result, we can actually see how common incest was in a huge range of historic societies. And what we know is incest in hunter-gatherer societies where people were raised together is 2 to 10 times as common as it is today. So in the ancestral evolutionary environment, everybody's banging their cousin.
Is that today in the West, Lyman, or today in somewhere like Pakistan?
No, when I say today, I mean since agriculture. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, I should.
Okay.
Historically recent time frames, only 8,000 years. So, in fact, it is still the case that if you look at like historically recent hunter-gatherer societies, that they have much higher rates of incest. And this is not conveniently just without belaboring it too much, because of some quirks of how humans inherit genes, we can actually see, is this just because of small population size? Like there just weren't many options of who to marry? Or is this because they like chose close partners? And it is not only small population size. Ancestral humans actually appear to they had sex with close relatives a lot. They didn't select against this. They certainly were not selecting against this. It's because we can identify background relatedness through like short runs of homozygosity, so like less than 8 centimorgans of runs of homozygosity, and then we can identify very close loops through like really long runs. So we can see that people who you don't see that everybody has like these really like a lot of short row and not a lot of long row. Okay, instead what you see is that they have a lot of long runs of homozygosity. They just really did form unions with close relatives. It wasn't selected against. Now, it might be strange to say it wasn't selected against since we know that this is really adverse. But we actually have other examples of this too. So there is a gene that was just identified like 6 months ago that's associated with quite poor pregnancy health. Okay. Like it causes spontaneous abortion, miscarriage at elevated rates. And we know that it reduces fertility today. Like people who have this gene have fewer children, they're more likely to be childless. Okay. But we also know, because again, we have enough genes over a long time horizon to actually directly observe selection, we know that this gene has been under active positive selection. Why? Because it doesn't only regulate miscarriage, okay? It also regulates the immunology and stuff like that. And incest does not only regulate deformity and stuff like that, it has other advantages in some settings for societies. And so it is not the case that we have this deeply evolved disgust mechanism. In fact, humans tend to prefer to marry people who, except for the fact that they don't have long runs of homozygosity, are genetically similar to siblings. Okay, that is they assortatively mate on fairly genetically similar people. Beyond that, the Westermarck effect has failed to replicate as many times as it has been replicated, okay? Yeah, there's some studies that show it. There's a lot that have gone looking and failed to show it. A classic one is with Israeli kibbutzim, where they were like, oh, these kids were all raised together. They must not want to have sex. And then they found that they were all having sex with each other. They said they didn't want to, but they were, okay? Because social desirability bias about saying you want to have sex with your sister is a thing, which is why incest porn is always labeled stepsister porn, okay? Because you wouldn't say it's also, there's like sometimes laws about producing incest porn that you have to evade. So you call it a step. But like the fact that people don't say that they want to like make out with their sister, like the history of human evolution suggests they will. I mean, Pakistan today is not the most incestuous society in human history if you trust the genetic data.
Diana, your response?
Well, my argument doesn't hinge that much on incest being intuitive genetics. We can move on at any time, but
it's interesting though. I'm interested. This was one of the first seminars I ever had as an anthropology undergraduate.
Yeah.
You know, there's like a long running debate within anthropology why are incest taboos pretty much universal.
Yeah,
it's quite tricky to answer.
I mean, I think Lyman is being slippery here. I don't think that my proposition that humans are disgusted by incest requires that people never engage in incest, or that some people are not turned on by incest.
Well, one might argue that actually if people aren't sufficiently disgusted by incest, then we need to coerce them legally.
Well, yeah, but I mean, so. you could say there's ideas that people are disgusted by rotting meat, but then there are societies where people regularly eat rotting meat, right? And you know, these exceptions, this is kind of the ongoing debate between anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists, where evolutionary psychologists say, you know, there is likely some universal adaptive module or a psychological mechanism that prevents maladaptive consequence X. And then you're like, oh, but the Ainu, that, you know, they worship bears or whatever. And like, you know, it's fine. But I don't think that my argument hinges so much on this idea. And, you know, nowadays it does seem like a lot of anti-incest and anti-cousin marriage laws are transparently eugenic. And so we could just kind of move on from that. We can totally cull the evolutionary explanation. It doesn't really matter, such that many people think that first cousin marriage should be banned and should be illegal, regardless of where that comes from.
I agree that some modern eugenic laws, particularly those formulated in the early and mid 20th century, modern like cousin marriage laws and incest laws, are eugenic, because that was the prevailing sort of way of talking about family models at the time when those laws were written, right? I mean, if the laws had been written 200 years earlier, they would have been justified some other way. Today, though, most anti-cousin marriage laws are not justified on eugenic grounds. They're usually justified on anti-Islamic grounds. Like that's actually if somebody comes out today and says, I want to ban cousin marriage, like that guy's probably not about to tell you about birth defects. He's probably about to talk about Sharia law. So I think, and I know that this is a bit of a tangent, but I think this is important because the thesis we're arguing, part of it rests on, Diana, your contention that actually people are kind of okay with kind of a soft eugenics, and you're really not asking them to accept something that's very far outside of what they already accept. What I'm suggesting is the idea that people just accept the eugenic explanation for these laws. I mean, The laws were passed with that because that's what was politically useful in 1932. That's not the reason people actually do accept these laws. The reason they accept these laws is because they have a lot of reasons for thinking that incest is bad. So it's actually asking quite a lot of people to accept that the reason they should support anti-incest laws is because of birth defects, when in fact, many people who support anti-incest laws would also oppose abortion for defects, right? So I think the argument I'm making here is you want to convince people that you're not asking very much of them, but I think you're actually asking quite a lot. And so I think a metaphor here, or an extension of this, is like all societies have natural bounds on various kinds of human freedom, and we're agreed. Neither of us supports like coercive. Neither of us wants people to like go in and like cut people's uteruses out for fun or something, right? So we're talking about like non-coercive measures, right? So like, we all agree that there is a volume of music that if I played it on my property, my neighbor would have a right to complain. Okay, like I could get like weapons grade sonic technology and I could like kill my neighbor with sound if I got it loud enough. Okay, and at that rate, he has like a right to come over and kill me, maybe. Okay, we're not talking about that scale of eugenic debate. We're talking about what's the level at which the noise I make justifies my neighbor knocking on my door and telling me that my music taste is bad. Okay. At what point do we say, okay, that's a justifiable reaction? Or do we say my neighbor is an asshole busybody who we should all make fun of and shun? And what I am arguing is, look, people accept that like birth defects aren't great. No one's like, yay, birth defects. And people may accept some degree of consideration of genetic quality or genetic potential in different ways. But what you're suggesting is that they really should accept a lot more tolerance of your neighbor coming over and telling you that your genes are bad and you shouldn't reproduce. That's what you're saying. That we should, not coercion, but that we should in fact be more willing to tell our neighbor that their genes are bad and they shouldn't reproduce if we think their genes are bad, right?
Are your neighbors psychotic criminals with schizophrenia? Like I'm talking about, I mean,
some of them.
This is like very weird Christian framing of my argument. And I'm not really sure, like, should we tell our neighbors they have bad genes? I mean,
I don't think there's anything Christian about that.
It's kind of impossible to avoid the religious point, but let's try and delay it as long as we possibly can for secular listeners. Christianity is, in the words of Tom Holland, the most disruptive, the most influential, and the most enduring revolution in history. And we are all children of this revolution, whether we go to church or not. That's why it makes sense to get to grips with Christian faith, whatever your background. And 321 is a fantastic way to do that. 321 is an online course presented by Glenn Scrivener, who you might know from this podcast. It's engaging, imaginative, and assumes no prior knowledge. Binge it in a couple of hours or take your time over 8 sessions. It's completely free. Go to 321course.com/MMM, enter your email, set a password, and you're in. No spam, no cost, just an invitation to look at life again through the lens of Jesus. Whether you're looking for an introduction to Christianity for yourself or looking to introduce others, find out more for free at 321course.com/MMM. Do you concede, Diana, that, as Lyman claims, we are moving, certainly this isn't just a small nudge, right? We are moving significantly if we were to adopt your policies. So your 3 policies, I've written just for simplicity. So one would be to offer for free screening for genetic diseases that are heritable. Another would be to pay addicts to take long-term reversible contraception or get sterilized. And a third would be to also to pay prisoners or psychiatric patients, to do the same thing. Those, as you say, I mean, when this was tried in the UK, the people were basically run out of town. They are significantly controversial. Do you concede Lyman's point that we are pushing significantly towards a new cultural direction where I suppose, if not your neighbour, then at least the state is having a much stronger judgment on which genes are good and which are not?
Okay, well, when the state comes and takes your children away and puts them in foster care, you're telling your neighbor, Shouldn't curse
Because
on
their
this
parents are
podcast.
siblings.
No,
So-
that you're shitty mother and you're a shitty father, and we're taking your children away because you're addicted to drugs or
Because
alcohol,
you're mistreating
right?
them.
Yeah, because you're mistreating them. You're not providing an adequate environment for children. And I know that the Mother, Maiden, Matriarch audience, which is largely against surrogacy, which is largely against gamete donation, which is largely against things like prostitution, and a lot of these things that people are against is because they harm children. My conjecture is that the only reason that we are not offering a woman who gives birth to a baby addicted to heroin a tubal ligation when she has a cesarean section right then and there, when it would be easiest to do, or the reason that we're not offering her to put an IUD in after we deliver her baby, is because of the legacy of eugenics. But so, part of the reason that I'm interested in asking a woman who's addicted to heroin, who has gives birth to a child who's addicted to opiates, if she wants an IUD, is because part of the reason is because I think that her child is very likely to also become an addict, right? I think that she's passing on a genetic propensity to addiction and shortened time horizon and other bad characteristics. But you could sell this very easily to the vast majority of people as this woman is going to bring more children into the world who are likely to have bad lives, who may be in and out of foster care, who may be temporarily raised by her, who may be abused by a stepfather, that kind of thing. And so the reason that we are not allowed to offer contraception or incentivize contraception is because of the legacy of eugenics, even though a straight up environmentalist, somebody who thinks that genes don't matter at all, would similarly think that this child is likely to end up as a burden on the state, on the burden as a community, and likely to cause suffering in their own lives and in the lives of others.
Should mention there's actually a lot of places here where Diana and I do agree. And one is she mentioned on an environmentalist would say this. And I should mention, I think she and I are agreed that genes are actually a huge part of social outcomes. The current tools that we have to measure genetic risks are, if not perfect, they're decently good for a lot of different traits. She and I were actually both just on Substack arguing with someone about the quality of schizophrenia, PGS scores, that we both think those are not made up.
Mm-hmm.
They measure something real. I want to be clear that this is not a debate between blank slateism and genetic realism. We're both people who think genes are real, think genes matter. And also, while I don't favor positive eugenics, I would love to see the human genome improved through other means. But what I did want to respond to there is taking kids away from parents. The reason the public accepts that is not because the public is squeamish about eugenics, but accepts this non-eugenic one. It's because the public tends to have, for better or for worse, kind of an acts righteousness framework, like a meritocratic view, okay? That as long as you don't do bad things, you can keep your kid. But if you do bad things, you can't. But there is an exception to this. Denmark has a program where parents can be flagged as high-risk parents, and they're given a test. And if they fail the test, the kid is preemptively taken away. And it's massively controversial. It was just covered in international news just a few weeks ago because there was a particularly controversial case. And the idea, a constant joke parents tell when they take a kid home from the hospital is isn't it weird that they just let us take this kid home? But you try and impose a test to let people take their kid home, you will have blood in the streets. Beyond that, I think it's worth mentioning, we do offer tubal ligations to people who don't want to have more kids. Medicaid will pay for it. My wife was offered one 2 weeks ago at the hospital when we brought our fourth kid home. They were like, by the way, you had your fourth, and we're not on Medicaid. There was no risk factor, but they were like, by the way, would you like a tubal ligation today? And we said no, but Medicaid will just pay for this. This is already policy. The reason people don't get it is because they want more kids. The main reason people don't get sterilized is because they still are interested in the possibility of having more children. Now, in some cases, they might not for cost reasons, but Medicaid in most states does pay for this.
I think that people, I'll turn to you in just a moment, Diana, but I think that people with short time horizons can be very responsive to financial incentives. I know that there was a study recently in the UK of trying to discourage pregnant women from smoking. Women were offered clothing vouchers, shopping vouchers, for every negative carbon monoxide test they had during their maternity checkups. And if they managed it, basically they got, I think it was something like £200. So it wasn't large sums of money. It was the amount of money for a nice winter coat, that kind of level, or a nice pair of boots. And yet that was sufficient. That was apparently more motivating than, and bear in mind this money couldn't be spent on like the basics of life. It could only really be spent on luxuries. And that was more motivating than protecting the child from the negative effects of smoking. So, but Diana, you probably have a similar kind of response.
I do think incentives matter. I think that people with short time horizons, people like addicts and criminals, they obviously don't want to conceive, and yet they have children accidentally all the time. And you could say, you can get free condoms, you can get free birth control. These are people who occasionally will, leave a chicken on the counter out too long and poison themselves. You can't necessarily say that these people are going to behave in a competent way. And speaking of things that Lyman and I agree on, I agree that it's eugenic for Lyman and his wife to have more children. I'm glad that she didn't take the tubal ligation. And she was not offered a tubal ligation for eugenic reasons. They could take one look at you and think, she was not offered that for eugenic reasons.
They offer it to everyone.
Well, they don't offer it in my state to everyone, and I live in one of the bluest states in this country. They don't even let you get an intrauterine device right after. You have to make a subsequent appointment. So this is, I don't know, this is not federal policy in any way. One of my obstetrician was complaining about this. So this is not federal policy in any way. I've never, maybe I've just never heard of such policies where somebody will go in, because they've had a psychotic episode and they say, here we've put you on some lithium, we've sedated you for a few days. Are you interested in an IUD? And an IUD is especially good, in the cases of women who have these kinds of problems, is because, doctors are differ on whether they will suggest this or not, but you can take one out yourself and you'll be able to get pregnant the next week. It's extremely reversible, and it's completely thoughtless what you have to do. In China, the way that they've tried to control the Uyghur population is with IUDs that you cannot remove, and so, but they're fairly benign in terms of how they influence women. So what I'm saying is specifically, and in terms of your foster care, I've just not heard of this Denmark case at all. But what you're saying is that something is okay. It's okay to tell your neighbor that they are a bad mother or father by taking away their kids. And the other point that I'm going to make, that Barbara Harris of Project Prevention, who pays addicts, is that when addicts have children in foster care, it rarely, according to her and according to some research, causes them to get clean. Oftentimes it makes them feel guilty and it causes them to relapse. And so it's also many ways better for an addict to be offered long-term contraception than to accidentally have children that they cannot care for and that they feel chronically guilty and ashamed about.
So I agree that offering a range of contraceptive options to people who might not want to have additional kids is a fine thing to do. As you noted, state level policies vary. Quirk of it is, in much of the South and New England, the legacy of eugenic policy is that it's actually, there's more of this stuff than out West. Just like the map of where these policies shake out based on when they were being passed, it tends to be that. But I think when we think about okay, should we pay an addict to get a sterilization? In my notes, I kind of had a more formal way of demonstrating this point, but I'm going to skip it and go to the more metaphorical one, which is I'm hoping we've all seen Squid Game, right? Or if not, we at least know the premise, right? Some very rich guys like to see poor people kill each other, so they offer them a massive lottery prize to incentivize them to do this very bad thing. Now, everybody who comes to Squid Game is informed, they consent, that they might not survive. Okay, all this stuff. To me, and maybe we get different messages from the show, but to me, the point of the show is this is obviously immoral. That you can't pay people to do things that are bad. Okay? You can pay people to do things that are good. Okay? But you can't be well, normally it would be bad to let me carve my name into your back. But what if you're poor and I offer you a sum that's kind of trivial to me, but it's life-changing for you because your life sucks? Most of us recognize on some level, again, I'm not even saying that it should be legally prohibited to do this, because the resolution we agreed on doesn't even talk about law. It just talks about moral suasion, okay? I'm saying that people who pay poor people to do things that poor people dislike doing or that are miserable or immiserating for them, we should see as kind of moral monsters, okay? We should shun them and snicker about them and whisper bad things behind their back, okay? I'm not saying we should haul them out and execute them, but I think that Project Prevention is gross and bad. And if somebody told me like, oh, I like pay poor people to do something that if I wasn't paying them to do it would be an internationally recognized like war crime, which is to sterilize people who did not previously desire to be sterilized, then like you shouldn't pay people to do things that under slightly adjusted circumstances are like significant crimes against humanity. I just think the fact that money changed hands shouldn't really assuage our guilt that much. And in the same way, like if like a billionaire philanthropist was like, look, I'm going to give like food to poor people, but like only if they do this silly dance first. But also like dancing is good exercise. Like it might help them, like, but like they have to do the silly dance that's humiliating for them, but funny for me. I'd be like, look, it's all cool that you're a philanthropist, but you're also despicable. Like, I just think that on some level, we have to acknowledge that we're talking about despicable acts here.
Okay, listeners won't know that, but Diana's facial expressions have been telling their own story. Diana, your turn.
Are you saying Project Prevention is gross and bad for the sake of this debate, or do you genuinely think that?
I genuinely think that providing poor people with vouchers to get sterilized that are considerably less worth considerably less than the statistical value of the lives they prevent, which is, anywhere from a few $100,000 to a few $1 million, is indeed despicable. I think that if you're going to pay people not to have kids, you should pay them the value of the kids, not what their short time horizon that
Wait,
will
hang
buy
on.
a lottery ticket.
Sorry, how are we valuing kids? Where's that?
The government has official estimates on the value of children. You can go with those.
So I do want to pause on this because I'm interested. Do you mean in terms of like I know that in the NHS we have a number which is basically an amount that we're willing to spend on per year of life on drugs, etc.
Yeah, sure.
Is that the kind of figure where, because of course for the poor people the children cost them a lot of money to raise, so it doesn't represent. They end up like being richer, surely, from not having the children.
I guess I would say when you're dealing with people with short time horizons who might not always make good financial decisions, leveraging their poor financial decision-making to get them to do the thing that you want to do and deprive them of their genetic legacy for the next however many thousands of years humans survive. Like, we're like, oh, these people have bad decision-making abilities. Let's offer them some gambling tickets.
Gotcha. Diana, what do you think?
People who are addicted to heroin and who are addicted to drugs and alcohol, when they conceive a child and they have a child in the hospital, do they want to have a child, Lyman?
Some do. In surveys, the share of births to women that have drugs in their system who say that those kids are wanted varies. It's really volatile, and the studies are not super high quality. It's not 0% who want it, but a considerable share, even if that child is unwanted, do report wanting additional children in the future.
Okay, well, Project Prevention it only does sterilization for men because unfortunately we have no reversible form of birth control. But Barbara Harris does keep statistics. She has never offered to sterilize, or no woman has taken the sterilization option who has not already had 2 or more children. She's never done that. And women choose sterilization because they don't want to engage in the upkeep. They have Norplant and IUDs as other options. So I don't think that. And in addition to that, she shows that a lot of these women had a lot of abortions. So would you be in favor of offering addicts long-term contraception if it prevents them having abortions? Do you think it's worse to have an abortion or to be on contraception?
Ooh, there's like a Sophie's choice for the conservative Christian. I wouldn't say there's a worse or better. And I know that is a cop-out. It is. I'll freely admit that. But at the same time, like, we have options. Like, if we're talking about making considerable philanthropic donations, we have options other than paying for sterilizations. Like, we just do. We could pay for other things that might also influence abortion odds.
Okay. Yeah, usually you like to bite bullets, Lyman, but you suck this time.
we risk getting into the abortion and contraception debates.
Let me move forward.
Was the subject of the last debate on the show. So something I really want to bring to the fore, which has kind of been raised but not really engaged with, is this question of state power. Because the thing that really disquiets me about this, I really buy. I mean, I agree with my modal listener, right? Like, I'm anti-surrogacy. I'm pro child welfare in every way. I also feel deeply distressed at children brought into the world addicted to heroin or brought into incredibly neglectful environments or whatever. I also want to prevent this. The thing that makes me most worried about your program, Diana, is the slippery slope in terms of state coercion, because I think that there is a difference between maintaining a millennia-long incest taboo in law and bringing in these new kinds of financial incentives, which are designed to influence who doesn't have children. That's the point. And I guess I worry about what happens next. You've raised the Uyghurs already as one example. It's not difficult to think of examples of states misusing this power in ways that none of us would like. And I guess, how do you think about that, Diana, in terms of this question of state power?
I think that you're exhibiting a sort of status quo bias. If foster care did not exist and I floated the idea to you that we could take children away from neglectful parents, you would say something like, "Oh, that seems like a slippery slope. Pretty soon everybody's going to take my children because I let them like walk to the shop or whatever." Or if I said, "Oh, we can imprison people who commit crimes," you would say, "Slippery slope. Soon we're going to imprison everybody." So I think that a lot of good ideas, state control that exists, somebody like Brian Kaplan, I'm kind of putting ideas in his head here, but he would probably be against some of these things because he likes to operate on the idea of a non-welfare state, a state that doesn't offer any incentives at all. And so in that case, if we lived in a free market libertarian society, eugenic principles would just be actualized in practice, but they would end up causing a lot of suffering. People would accidentally neglect their children to death. But since we're talking about status quo bias a little bit, I'm going to introduce this thing that Nick Bostrom talks about that kind of unveils status quo bias, which is called the reversal test. And so Lyman says it's bad to give people money to sterilize them or to engage in long-term contraception because having children is good, even if you're going to give them up for adoption or they're going to be in foster care. And so would you be in favor of a program that offered fertility treatment to active addicts?
Lyman?
Possibly. Kind of depends on the fertility treatment. I guess I would say, look, fertility treatment is already offered in Medicaid in many states. And I wouldn't say you can't have it because you have an addiction, because I think that's silly. That's just open discrimination. So no, I wouldn't deny someone access to a generally provided benefit. Now, would I say that like a philanthropist should supererogatorily go out of their way to give money for fertility treatments for drug addicted people? No, but I think status quo bias is actually a moral good. I think it's actually good to look at the world and say, like, if you're going to change something, you need strong reasons. Like, things as they are approximately tolerable to most people. And so, yeah, we actually do need special moral justifications to make changes, even if a counterfactual world that had those changes went in a way that we thought was similarly good to the current one. Right? The status quo actually exists. It actually has moral standing because the people who exist in the status quo actually exist and actually have rights. So I would say that while I wouldn't Bill Gates comes to me and says, "Lyman, I'm looking for a new philanthropic endeavor. What should I do? Should I fund Clomid for drug addicts?" I would say, no, I think there's many better uses of your charitable giving.
But do you think it would be good?
No, I mean, I think there's
you're saying it would be a net good.
Uses.
No, but I'm saying you're saying it would be a net
good.
I mean,
like, people are a net good. Like,
obviously,
like a person who's alive for one day and dies in suffering is a net good.
Okay. So another point that I've made is that prison is de facto eugenic, right? Part of the reason that we keep people out of society, I think, is in part because and there was a prisoner years ago who tried to send sperm in the mail, a vial of sperm, to his wife or girlfriend, or smuggle some out so that she could impregnate herself. Should prisoners be allowed either visits or interventions that would allow them to have offspring while in prison?
I would say that there is not a presumptive right that the state should incur additional costs on the behalf of a criminal to enable them to reproduce. That is to say, when they committed the crime, they chose to do the time. But at the same time, most states do allow conjugal visits for a range of certain types of crimes, on the understanding that going to some length to allow people basic biological autonomy is not entirely unreasonable. So I would say, again, current law allows conjugal visits for some classes of criminals in some jurisdictions. And I don't think that's crazy. And I think that this also suggests that your theory that prison is eugenic, I mean, it may have eugenic effects, but almost no one is thinking of prison as a eugenics solution, right? People aren't like, well, this guy, his crime doesn't really merit 20 years in prison, but he's carrying bad genes, so we better keep him in prison for 20 years. Like, no one is doing that. There's no country where things operate that way. But I will note that, again, Denmark is like kind of the poster child for what you're talking about. Denmark actually did have a program of mass sterilization of people that they felt were irresponsible, Greenlanders. And they also continue to have a program of mass removal of Greenland. Like almost 50% of Greenlandic kids grew up in foster care. And there is, I will say, considerable debate about why that is. And I'm not going to say that I have a perfect resolution. I'll say some of it is definitely justified. The optimal rate of Greenlandic children in foster care is definitely higher than the optimal rate in some other society, but it might not be as high as Denmark maintains it at. But my point in this is the effect of this is that, like, when Denmark started rolling out these policies, within 10 years, Greenlandic independence was a political movement. So the reason I bring this up is to say, like, again, just to emphasize, like, the things you're suggesting in some places have been done and are being done, and they're not unreasonable. Like, for example, offering people a tubal ligation if they're on Medicaid and they just had a baby. Okay. It's not totally unreasonable, although Puerto Ricans have a history with it that they might get mad about. But then other things you're proposing, the additional step you suggest has been taken places, and the result is like independence movements that would reshape the defense structure of NATO. So these like aren't small suggestions to like nudge society a little bit.
I mean, you're arguing against a slippery slope that I don't think I'm arguing for. So, it's like what I just said. If I said we should imprison criminals, you're like, should we imprison people who jaywalk? I'm not saying that. And, when you're kind of bringing up this Danish test, okay, I'm starting to be interested in interrogating Lyman's position because I think it's so extremely weird. So you don't think that there are better or worse kinds of people to exist? You think all existence is good, and you would never put like a quality, like it's better for such one kind of person to exist than another kind of person?
Some people's lives are definitely better than others, but I think that almost all lives are net positive.
So, like, let's say,
but things can be net positive. I mean, we can talk about like utils here, but like you can imagine a life that had net positive utils of 1 million. You can imagine a life that had net positive utils of 45 quadrillion, whatever that means. The second one is higher than the first one, but I think it's very rare that you actually find a life where its value in expectation is a negative number.
Okay.
I think it's exceedingly rare.
So there's this case that I talk about in my eugenics piece, and it's this case where a guy lies at a sperm clinic. He has 34 offspring. He's a criminal. He has bipolar disorder. He doesn't have a degree or anything like that. And the women who use the sperm are seeking recourse from the state. And in Georgia, they said, sorry, there's no like wrongful life suit that we can, but they ended up settling. The sperm clinic ended up settling. According to you, nothing bad happened.
No, not at all. First of all, fraud is fraud, even if it does no harm, right? So,
but no harm was done in the existence of these children.
No. I'm saying even if there was no harm done, and I'm not saying there was no harm done, but even if there was no harm done, I think, in fact, I've argued strenuously that I think we should be thinking about like a genetic bill of rights for children, right? I think it should be illegal to conceal genetic parentage from children, for example. They should be able to know their genetic parents. They should be able to know their names. I think anonymous sperm donorship should be a crime. I think every sperm donor should have to disclose his name and address to all of his biological children, or at least he should have to provide a genetic sample that they can have when they turn 18 to whatever. Okay. I think like fraud is bad on its own. So like bringing up a case where, well,
put aside the fraud, put aside the dishonesty, right? Put aside the fraud and the dishonesty. Let's say,
a clinic, like, I mean, this is a very live issue for like Orchid Health or Heritability or these companies, right? That they publish PGS scores that they actually have no way of knowing if the trait will develop because there's not been like 40-year tests of a PGS score, right? Now, they can look at the embryo and they can see that the genes came out the way they anticipate, but they don't yet know if the traits are going to develop. So the question is, in 30 years, are people going to have like, maybe one of these PRS scores was really badly calculated? I mean, in general, they're probably pretty reliable, but maybe one of them is quite bad. Are those people going to have a class action lawsuit? And I think probably They should. Now, I don't know if they
Let me
actually
pivot.
will, but I think they should.
Sorry, you're going about embryo selection. I don't want to talk about embryo selection. I want to talk about, let's say there's a rapper or a musician who's floridly schizophrenic, and he decides to give away his sperm, as much of it as he wants, and thousands of women decide to have babies with this man's sperm instead of having babies with, I don't know, people who don't have schizophrenia. That's not bad to you. That's good because more people exist.
Well, hold on. You said instead. So if they're replacing an alternative birth with this one, then it might be bad, right? Because they might have created a life with net positive 1 million utils instead of 42 quadrillion utils. Okay.
I'm so weird. It's so weird that you're talking in terms of utilitarianism. You don't agree with utilitarianism at all. So
it's a useful heuristic.
My culture is not your costume, Lyman.
Yes, it is. I will wear a utilitarian skin suit over my virtue ethics. But the point is, it's a useful heuristic, right? That, like, sure, there can be things that are less good. Yes.
Okay,
absolutely.
So it's better for somebody who is floridly schizophrenic to have a child than to never reproduce, according to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Human life is awesome. And by the way, I think we actually have good empirical proof of this. So schizophrenia, actually, you're kind of neutering an argument I was hoping to make by going with schizophrenia. So let's
I'd love to neuter you. I mean, not neuter
you. Let's pretend you said something really painful instead of something that causes mental illness. I think it's worth noting that, like, people typically think about this in terms of, like, conditions that cause shortened life expectancy or physical pain. That's usually what people go to. I actually think schizophrenia is pretty easily, because, like, most schizophrenics subjectively prefer to continue living, which tells us that their lives are net positive. But I think it's interesting that, like, people often talk about really painful conditions, like helping your child avoid really painful conditions.
Tay-Sachs, thalassemia. Yeah.
But pain doesn't predict suicide. Okay, like, we have longitudinal data where we can look at people's pain scores on various scales and look at their suicides later on. Pain barely predicts suicide. What predicts suicide is, like, feeling hopeless, which is surprisingly uncorrelated with pain. Feeling unsupported by people in your life, feeling like your life has no meaning, like stuff like this. That, like, the thing that, like, and when people say, oh, I think my life has a net negative value, like revealed preferences or GTFO, like only suicide counts for assessing a negative life valuation, okay? Anything else is just, like, cheap talk. So suicide is really the only thing we have to think about. So to understand net negative value lives, we really only have to know predictors of suicide. And since physical pain really isn't one, I just think we should consider that lives of enormous pain are not net negative lives. Now, schizophrenia is a bit different because schizophrenics do actually have considerably higher suicide rates. It's still quite rare. Most people don't commit suicide, but I will grant that schizophrenia is a condition that much more plausibly would justify avoiding having a child, on my way of thinking of things, than a condition that simply causes diminished life expectancy or severe pain.
This episode is sponsored by Relay, one of those brands that's just such a perfect fit with MMM. I think what they're doing is excellent. Relay is an app that helps people stop using porn. And let's be honest, porn is basically everywhere on the internet. Most men see it first as teenagers. It quietly becomes part of life. But over time, it leaves a mark. You're more distracted, less present, less patient. It eats away at integrity, makes secrecy feel normal, and creates distance in your relationships. Many men feel stuck in the cycle, ashamed, frustrated, and wondering if change is even possible. That's where Relay comes in. It's therapist accredited and built on solid therapeutic principles, but the real difference is that you're no longer fighting alone. Relay places you in a private group with other men on the same journey, giving you daily accountability, encouragement, and tools to handle triggers whenever they pop up. You can stay totally anonymous while getting the real support you need to build a life of integrity. It's about becoming the husband, the father, the man that you were meant to be. Relay has already transformed the lives of thousands of men and the lives of their partners. Don't let the pattern continue. You don't have to stay stuck. Go to joinrelay.app/Maiden and use the code Louise, that's all capital letters Louise, to try it out for free. That's joinrelay.app/Maiden. Lyman, can I ask, is your human life is awesome? Like, I'm with you, but Diana might not be. I don't know. We can get into that. But would your ideal outcome be infinity humans populating the universe? We just have enormous levels of reproduction, and that would obviously be great because every human life is great. Or is it more that you are very wary of any kind of policy, ideology, etc., that seeks to suppress reproduction. And it's more, you argue against that more than you are arguing for infinity Elon babies populating the universe.
Oh, I want to have infinity babies to populate the universe.
Okay.
And in fact, not only do I want to have that, I will bite the bullet on this one and just show my cards. Like, I am a conservative Christian, which means I believe that I will be resurrected from the dead and I will live forever, which solves a lot of problems in space travel, right? Okay? Because you can just live forever. A slow ship is fine. So like not only do I want to populate the galaxy, I believe I will. So yeah, I can solve that. Now, secondarily, I think even if you don't agree with me, and I assume many listeners don't share my heavenly space futuristic eternalism, whatever you want to call it, I think it is also true that the slippery slope is actually not a fallacy. That in fact, we often do observe that one thing leads to another. Sometimes it doesn't, but it often does. And so simply saying that something may be a slippery slope is not a rebuttal. Now, I would also just point out, I may have made some slippery slope appeals. It's possible. I'll grant it. Yes, I am concerned about next steps, but I just want to return, because I am a stickler for formality, that the resolution that Diane and I agreed on actually wasn't limited to like 3 or 4 policies. It was just that people who carry genes that are likely to cause children great suffering or render their children incapable of economic independence should be socially discouraged from reproducing. Okay, which I think is
economic
is
independence.
broad.
We haven't really got into yet. Yeah.
Yes. So that's what I was going to mention. Economic independence applies to about 10 to 20% of the population. Even if you do life course, we all live in budget deficit countries. Okay. Most people are net negatives individually, but of course they may be a net positive societally. That is, if you killed off all the net negative people, the economy would collapse and the net positive people would be a lot poorer, because it turns out economies are really complicated. Individuals who are net negative may nonetheless be crucial elements of societies that are highly generative.
It's worth saying for the listeners that this was our discussion over email. So Diana, you did raise the economic independence question.
I did not. it was in the email. But I'm actually interested in kind of one other theoretical, the economic independence. You might be right, and I don't necessarily think that economic contribution is necessarily. I'll kind of retract this a little bit. Necessarily an indicator of quality. There are a lot of people who bring a lot to society and who are of great benefit, but who are not, economically independent. Children are a good example. So in this, there's this Donahue and Levitt paper that's quite famous for saying that legalizing abortion has reduced the crime rate, and they even put a number on. They don't put this in eugenic terms, but they say people who live in unpropitious environments, people whose parents neglect them, are likely to become criminals. And they actually put a number, I think, that something like abortion has reduced has prevented 40,000 murders. So let's have another kind of theoretical for Lyman's position is let's say that we could tell with 80% certainty that somebody was going to become a murderer with like some kind of PGS score, right? Would you think that it's good to bring murderers?
That's a heck of a PGS score.
Yeah.
So first of all,
or do you think being a murderer is heritable, and do you think murderers should be discouraged from reproducing?
Criminality is quite heritable, isn't it?
It
right?
is,
Like,
yeah.
I haven't seen like the latest literature, but I think it's quite heritable.
May I just say, this is why I invited you both on, because it would be really boring if we had a blank slatist and a behavioral geneticist against each other. Like, you're both basically with the program when it comes to behavioral genetics.
I just want to flag right here, we should just stop the debate, because guys, I won. A negative only has to win on one part of a proposition under like formal Lincoln Douglas rules. So let's just flag. No, I'm joking. Okay. But no, I totally get economic independence is a little squishy, and I grant that one's perhaps overbroad. And I think it's an important caveat to note that, okay, maybe we really shouldn't think about economic independence as a criteria. We should really just think about these other harder issues. So on murderers, yeah. So I mean, crime is probably quite heritable. I don't know the best recent estimates. I do think it's important to keep in mind that the way like math on heritability works when you're talking about rare events. So like if you're talking about something like half the population is a 0 and half the population is a 1, the heritability estimate is like it's actually like a really good predictor. Like you really will end up like this. Okay. But like Broadson's heritability, when you're talking about something that's like 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, like being a murderer, even a really high heritability score is actually going to have very low accuracy. Like most of the people that are flagged as like probably a murderer won't be. Like that's just, there's no way around, like no matter how precise this is basically just type 1 versus type 2 error type of problem. And there's not really a way out of it. But let's imagine that there is. And we can pre-crime the murderers.
That's
Yeah. So I think it's a simple math problem of like how many life years does the average murderer eliminate versus how many do they experience? Because even a murderer's life has some
This is
value.
very utilitarian.
So if a murderer is going to experience like 63 life years that are reasonably worthwhile, but they're going to eliminate 418 life years. Or alternatively, I'm also open to moral weights. If we say like, look, okay, the murderer's life years have some value, but like killing an innocent child, like we're counting their life years like 10 times as much. I'm fine with that. But ultimately, yeah, there's kind of a math problem. Like even if utilitarianism is wrong as an actual ethical judgment, which it is, it's still a necessity as a like social math is still a necessity. There's no way to run a society without math. So fundamentally, like if you knew perfectly, like of course you kill baby Hitler, like duh, every time. And you do that even if he's like, if you have to put a bullet in the back of his head, you do that. If you can prevent his conception, you do that. Like that's fine. But the point is, we don't know that. Like the best PGS score for homicide you could ever, like if you had a PGS score that was as accurate as current genetic testing for like Down syndrome in the womb, you would still end up preventing mostly non-murderers from being born.
Okay, so let me summarize your position here. You know, my conjecture, I've never argued about total utilitarianism in this way, and I used to hang around with effective altruists full time in Oxford. Nobody's ever argued this way, not Toby Ord, not Will McCaskill, like nobody. But let's say that, you know, what you said that, you know, kill yourself or GTFO. Basically, you want to live if you're not killing yourself. What about the suffering that somebody imposes on other people, right? What about like let's say I just feel that maybe when you're thinking about let me finish. When you're thinking about the total utilitarian view, are you also thinking about the suffering that some people will impose upon other people? Like I'm talking about extremely dark triad psychopathic people.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that is important to account for. So if you could, with sufficiently high reliability, identify people who are going to create so much suffering and your false positives were essentially zero, then yeah, you might have an argument. So like technology could change the space of things that are possible. But in this is where Donahue and Levitt is really important, this abortion paper. The important thing, so the 2001 paper got a lot of crap because they had some just basic math errors in it. They had a 2019 version where they corrected the math errors. Yay, always in favor of correcting math errors. The problem is, it was still wrong. It didn't have math errors, but it did just have an incorrect, like the model was not incorrectly calculated, but it was like analytically was not giving the estimate they thought. We also know this because we've had extensions in Romania, Canada, and a bunch of European countries to see if abortion reduces crime in other environments. And the answer is no, it doesn't. The only paper that has found this relationship is Donahue and Levitt. Even other authors looking at the same data have failed to reproduce it in different model specifications, I think better ones. So I think that should actually tell us that this in practice, we can argue for like a theoretical non-existent technology that's also not going to exist anytime in the next century. But in practice, like actually aborting more people didn't lower crime rates in any of the countries that we have data for it on. It just didn't, which is kind of surprising because it was mostly people who had a higher propensity to crime. The basic reason for this is because abortion and contraception are substitutes. Okay. It didn't actually reduce birth rates for those women. So we also see like the Dobbs states, the states that have repealed abortion laws, have not had like huge baby booms, even once you account for mail order abortions. And the reason is because people just use contraception. So you could say, well, Lyman, are you saying then you should ban contraception? No, because I also believe in individual freedom.
I think this touches on an important question, which we haven't like completely engaged with, which is what if eugenic policy gets it wrong? I mean, something that Mary Harrington likes to point out is like empirically wrong in terms of the outcomes that you want don't actually occur. And Mary Harrington likes to point out that Margaret Sanger's idea, when she was campaigning for abortion on eugenic grounds, was that it was the poor and the addicts and all of these, in her eyes, undesirables who would stop having children. What's actually ended up happening is that upper middle class women, Margaret Sanger's girls, right, are exactly the women who are very likely to both support and use this access to this medical technology. What seems to quite often happen in reality is that societies are very complicated. You might go in with a particular intervention in the hope that it will affect who does and does not have babies, and then that doesn't happen. And maybe there's a lesson there in excessive hubris. What Lyman might say, I'm daring you to say, is it's because God doesn't want us to do this stuff. And so he reliably punishes us when we try. That might not be as persuasive as Diana, though.
I'm not a historical providential determinist, so I can't make that argument.
It would be helpful if you would give me a failure mode, because the policies that and by the way, since Lyman just told me he won, I would also say that Lyman says it's actually okay to do negative eugenics on people who are definitely going to be murderers. Yep.
Okay.
I concede that.
But, okay, so maybe I could come up with an example. If we were to end up by paying some people to sterilize themselves or use contraception, we might end up reducing the psychopathy rate in society. We might discover that actually psychopathy to some degree is useful, and it might in the long term actually have negative consequences that we can't possibly foresee. And this is an argument in general against attempts at mass social engineering, not just eugenics, but all sorts of things, I suppose.
I mean, I definitely think that if you were going to implement a policy like, offering active addicts some kind of contraception, Lyman might be right. I don't think that Lyman is right. But yeah, I think that the people who have abortions are people who are often, and I'll just say it, too stupid or to have too short a time horizon to use contraception effectively. I saw some report on this woman who got an abortion who said that she had 2 different forms of contraception fail, and it was just statistically impossible that those 2 forms of contraception, that the birth control pill and an IUD would both fail on her. She just managed to use them both incorrectly. And so, in my view, people who cannot adequately avoid pregnancy are either in a very impulsive mode of life or are just not smart enough to use contraception reliably. And I think contraception is, as Lyman said many times, is easy to get and easy to use. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting to look at these kind of knock-on effects. There are some people who say that psychopathy as a trait, it's hard to look at it over time, may have increased because it's easier for a psychopath to go from place to place to impregnate one woman and then go to another city and impregnate another, and without people having the kind of word of mouth to say what he's done. So I think that we might have experienced lower rates of psychopathy in the past. But I think that, offering people with Huntington's disease, something like free IVF so that they will choose embryos that don't have Huntington's, something like that, I don't think has very many unintended consequences. I guess I say it's possible that offering contraception for women who are in active addiction or who have other kinds of problems, or sterilization for men who've committed serious crimes that we know are heritable, I find that difficult to believe that would have bad knock-on consequences any more than, people rarely reproduce in prison. I actually looked at the data on conjugal visits. I found that conjugal visits are actually quite rare, but I'm happy to be corrected on this. But we would find the same thing, right? If we went from imprisoning some crimes a little bit to a lot, that would also end up de facto limiting the reproduction of such people. And so we would also see such knock-on effects in that same kind of case. In many ways, I think that offering people contraception is a more humane intervention than imprisoning them or taking away their children. And that's part of why I'm in favor of it.
I agree that offering someone contraception is more humane than putting them in prison, but they're also not really closely related. Because there's very few things where it's like either you go to prison or you get on contraception. The only case is like the German incest case, but they were offered contraception.
Or child abuse might be an example. You might say that you've neglected your children in the past and therefore you can't have any more, or you go to prison.
You can imagine something like this, but I think it's worth remembering the reason that societies might accept something like sterilizing or, subsidizing contraception for a child abuser or something like that, or for a pedophile, let's say, is actually not for eugenic reasons. Like, it might have a eugenic effects, but that's probably not why people would support it. They would support it because they would say this person's actions have revealed a pattern of behavior. If you had a PGS score for pedophilia, nobody would say, well, we're going to sterilize all the people with a high PGS score for pedophilia, but all the actual pedophiles who had a low PGS score, because no PGS score is perfect, we're just going to leave them out in society. Okay, that's not what people say. In the same way, this is why it's not proper to think of marriage selection as eugenic. So think about like a case of identical twins. Suppose you have two identical twins, same genes. They're not going to have identical outcomes, right? They're going to be slightly different. Imagine a case where they're quite a bit different, which does happen sometimes. One of the twins is like a top 10% earner, all this. The other twin is like bottom 10% addicted to drugs. The fact that they have the same genes is not going to change the fact that the top earner is going to be way more valuable as a mate. Nobody's going to go, oh, well, they have the same genes, so it doesn't matter which one I marry. No. Now, twins are highly correlated, but they're not identical. People phenotypically select. Now, phenotypic selection, of course, has some eugenic effects because genotype and phenotype are highly correlated. For some traits, they're identical. For some traits, they're strongly correlated. For some ways, they're weakly correlated. But the point is, because people phenotypically select rather than directly genotypically select, it's really, it's not even relevant to think of like marriage selection or something as a eugenic activity, because that just fundamentally at the decision level is not what people are doing.
I think one of the fundamental things that Lyman is doing a lot in this debate that I disagree with is that he overestimates people's conscious awareness of the reasons that they think things are bad, right? Like most people who oppose cousin marriage, might be against Muslims marrying. People are just think, I'm disgusted by thinking about having sex with my first cousin. Therefore, I think other people shouldn't do it. It's the disgust. It's not the incest aversion or the possibility of birth defects with consanguineous unions. There's that study where they showed people 5 pairs of identical pantyhose and they asked them to pick which one that they like best. And they said, this one's softer. And they were like all identical, right? So I just don't think that people are as rational as Lyman thinks they are. And in terms of like, we offer people contraception, we offer people tubal ligation. I just don't think that these things work necessarily if similarly to we were talking about status quo bias, people also have a status quo bias in their lives. Like, oh, I don't really know if I want to undergo tubal ligation. That's why incentives work. And similarly to, like cigarette smoking, right? You have to make cigarettes expensive. If you just suggested to people, maybe you could stop smoking, that's not a good smoking intervention. Or if you told people that smoking causes different kinds of health problems, you can't assume that because somebody keeps smoking that they're not aware of the health problems or they don't care about the health problems, which is, I think, what Lyman would assume given his premises about human rationality, which I think are extreme in this debate.
Yeah, I don't really think people are very rational. I just think, in fact, I would agree that they're not very rational, which is why I don't think they're eugenicists, because I don't think they're thinking about the genes.
So eugenics is rational?
Islam or discuss. No, in the sense of a goal-directed behavior, not in the sense of true. What I'm saying is not, people are rationally being like, well, my top 3 reasons for supporting incest laws are this. It's just, I'm saying that I don't think that eugenics are actually the reason they do these things, because they're not very rational. They have a range of inchoate reasons, mood affiliations. But I do want to mention on this whole, like, we need incentives, we agree on another factual point here, which is that like just offering people free contraceptives or whatever has not had the eugenic effects that eugenicists would like. The problem is that you mentioned smoking, which I think is a great example. Smoking is massively punitively taxed. Like, choosing to smoke is way more expensive than it would be in a free market. People still do it. Incentives are not enough. You try an incentive program to solve this problem, it's not going to get solved. But once you're in the mindset that what you should be doing is engaging in significant government interventions that do it, because all government intervention is some level of
most
coercion.
smoking cessation stuff is punitive. It's not incentives. They don't usually offer to pay people to stop smoking. It usually just tax the hell out of, and they put pictures of lung cancer on it. Anyway, I have a good paper. It's called Zigarelle. You could maybe put it in the show notes, that asks people, since we're getting back to public policy, support for eugenic policies. This is an MTurk sample. Lyman can have a look at it at some point and tell you what it thinks in the comments. But support for encouraging poor people to have fewer children, 45% support among the general public. Support for encouraging wealthy people to have more children, 15%. Support for encouraging people who have committed serious crimes to have fewer children is also at around 45%. So nearly half of the population agrees that we should encourage people who commit serious crimes or who are poor to have fewer children.
And only 10% of the population thinks that they are poor people. People think that things should be done to other people. That's true. But when push comes to shove and they have to listen to a debate where one politician makes the actual argument that actually this might be you, that maybe you get unemployed for a few years and now you're poor people, they change their minds. Public opinion polling is notoriously difficult. It's always weird to, I'm always in these strange situations where it becomes notable to mention my PhD is not actually in like population ethics or something. It's in survey design. I design surveys. And yeah, it's actually quite difficult to use surveys to figure out what policies people really support, which is why no party has yet found a durable majority based on the coherent policy set.
I mean, think like that. I used to be really into animal ethics stuff, and like most people think that animals should be treated as good as pets, and that there should be a total ban on caged eggs.
And they clearly
and stuff like
don't.
That. Yeah, and obviously they would buy that stuff in a minute. They do it all the time. Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. The way that I've concluded these debates previously, and it's worked nicely, and maybe we could give it a go, is to try and encourage a little bit of steel manning from both of you, specifically asking, if you were to win out, okay, in Lyman's case, I guess you're defending the status quo, so it's slightly different, but certainly for Diana, if you were to win out and your policies were enacted, what do you envision would be the most painful trade-off? And Lyman, I will ask the same question. Like, what is the most painful trade-off right now?
It's possible that, like, let's say somebody went to a food stamp office and they saw condoms, or they went to the methadone clinic and they were offered, sterilization or contraception. There's this concept in behaviorism called counter control, where people do things because they want to evade control. So it's possible that people who are, the state is attempting to control in this way, say, F you, I'm going to do the opposite, and I'm going to have children to spite you. Right. And so that is a possibility. I mean, I don't know if I'm biting the bullet adequately on that. That's the only thing that I can think of.
Do you worry about the slippery slope at all? We've raised this a few times in the course of the episode, but is it something that niggles at you at all, that this would end up becoming more coercive over time?
No, because I think that even if it was a bit more coercive, it still wouldn't be bad. There's a very high level of coercion that I think would be bad. And I think even... we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but there's a judge in Florida, I think, who offered a man vasectomy because he was in prison for not paying child support for like 5 children. And they offered him like a month. In principle, I'm against that. Like, I don't think that you should offer somebody a month-less prison in exchange for sterilization. But in practice, if somebody did it, I probably think it would be a good overall. Yeah.
Okay. Lyman, what's the most painful trade-off of the status quo? There's kind of an obvious answer, but I don't know, maybe you have a different one.
I mean, I think the most painful part of the status quo is, look at the world around you. There's obvious problems. There are children born to parents who can't take care of them, and they suffer for it. And we all suffer because we pay for a very expensive foster care system. There are children born with conditions that if we perfectly identified them in the womb and aborted them, we wouldn't have to observe their suffering. I think it's not proper to say that they wouldn't suffer with it, because, that's like saying, oh, if you kill someone, they don't suffer with the condition. Well, yeah, you killed them. There's elements of our current regime that are unpleasant. Some people worry about dysgenic fertility. Maybe we're getting to be a less and less functional society. That'd be a fun debate for another day. I would say the best solution to that is, well, first of all, I would say empirically that's not the case. But secondly is that one other place that Diana and I are in principle agreement, if not in practice agreement, is in the long run, we should hope for a world where humans are considerably genetically improved through
CRISPR, for instance,
not through selection, not just through like, oh, we didn't let the poor people have kids or something, but because we just make our babies better directly. Now, right now that involves destroying a lot of babies, which I'm not in favor of, but I look forward to a day when it doesn't involve that, when we can directly modify germlines. We can already do somatic gene therapies directly on people. I look forward to when we can do germline modification non-destructively. Maybe it'll be a long time, but I hope we get there eventually. The fact that what I'm suggesting means that we might have to deal with a society where there are people around us who inconvenience us, who cause difficulties for us. That is a real trade-off. But what I would say is, in the same way that Diana's trade-off was kind of like in a job interview when you ask, what are your weaknesses? And you say, I'm so humble. She was like, well, a weakness is that I might not quite be fully successful in getting rid of the people with bad genes. What I would say is the norms I am suggesting that yes, you should have like a competitive society. We're not saying that you should like pretend that everyone is the same. There's no differences between people at all, but that like you cannot exterminate the pores. You must have norms of compassion. You must prioritize unborn life. You cannot kill the sick and the old. These are simply the norms that created the most successful civilization humanity has ever seen, which is the Christian West. If you want to know, like, what does it look like if you like instill these norms through military victory in a society for 2,000 years, what you get is the West, and it rocks. It's so good. Like, I think and also it's not just the West. In Meiji Japan, when they wanted to modernize, one of the first things they did was ban seppuku and crack down on infanticide, because they recognized that if you want advancement, if you want a progressive attitude towards life, you actually have to have an intrinsically valuational attitude towards life. And so while there are trade-offs, there are 100% trade-offs in just keeping the level of eugenics at the level it's at right now. Like, if you think of eugenics as noise violations, as I thought of it before, like allow the current level of annoying noise there is, but no more. All we're saying is, like, allow the system that has been so successful for the last several hundred years to keep going.
On that note, I think we have to leave it, but thank you so much, both of you. I thought that was fun. I mean, for a debate on something so grisly, it was surprisingly fun. So thank you both for making it so.